Earlier today, the Times columnist Melanie Phillips remarked that red wall voters were more conservative than the Conservative Party. I think that's pretty accurate, to be quite honest with you. And it explains what I want to talk about today. It explains the choice that lies ahead for the Conservative Party itself. In Wordsworth's famous poem on the French Revolution, he actually remarked, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." It's a bit like how I felt during the Brexit referendum. In 2016, when I was but 22 years old, I was asked to introduce the then Mayor of London, who was launching the North East campaign for the official Vote Leave campaign in the EU referendum. I stand there and I give my speech, not unlike this one, a room full of about 500 people, and I think, thank God I survived that. And in walks this flash of blonde, rubbing his hair as he goes, and shakes my hand. Now, thankfully, it was Boris Johnson and not Sadiq Khan, because I imagine the response would have been somewhat different. He certainly wouldn't have been saying it was a good speech. And Boris filled the room with a message on how my region could benefit from taking back control, from actually restoring the kind of national sovereignty that my grandfather's generation once recognised. Now, I'd never met an old Etonian before, and I'd never heard a Conservative address a room of 500 people from ex-industrial heartlands in the northeast of England receive a reception quite like this one. My family would hark back to Thatcher, right? They would hark back to the Conservative Party being responsible for shutting down parts of the economy that gave people purchase over their own lives, that gave people a really important sense of self. But every single man or woman, if I'm allowed to say that, I see there's a T-shirt over there explaining what a woman is very helpfully. Now, every man and woman rose to their feet and gave this old Etonian a massive round of applause. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was delighted. A year later, in 2017, my late grandfather told me that he would be voting for Theresa May. Now, we all know now that she was about as much use as a chocolate teapot, but nonetheless, it was a real moment for me personally to actually see an ex-coal miner, Labour through and through, saying, look, I recognise that that party has moved so far away from where I am politically that I can no longer vote for it. He put his hope, he put his trust in the Conservatives. Now we get to 2019 and my granddad had a few friends, I think it's fair to say. The aforementioned old Etonian managed to secure an 80-seat majority and win over Labour and many first-time voters, actually, people who perhaps had just refused to vote altogether, actually thought, this is my moment, this vote matters. And that, my friends, was always my concern about Brexit, that if we didn't deliver on that vote, we would frankly poison politics for a generation. The brilliance of Boris, despite being what you would call a posh Tory stereotype, was that he managed to highlight the elitism of liberal democracy so very beautifully. It wasn't won by a message on the side of a bus, as those outside might like to try and suggest. There were a fair few factors at play. Voters were worried about mass migration. We've mentioned it, I think, in most speeches here over the past 3 days. For merely holding those concerns, you're dismissed as some kind of bigot, rather than holding views that actually are justifiable, in my view, around employment, income, and social cohesion. I had a chat with the protesters outside, actually, for Reasoned, my YouTube channel, which you must all check out. And these protesters dismiss voters as thick for rejecting their prospectus. It's a reminder of the kind of narrative that cost the Liberal left so dearly. I think they ought to look at themselves in the mirror as they screech like banshees the word fascism. These are the people that said that young people's votes in that EU referendum should count not once, but twice, to relegate older voters as meaningless when it comes to the ballot box. I can think of nothing more scary when it comes to democracy. If you ask me, they're more aligned with fascism than anybody I've heard at this conference here today. Now, former Labour voters that voted for Boris and for Brexit, the middle and lower classes live in totally different lives, but share in many of the same views. You put them together in a pub, and I imagine they'd be able to have a pretty canny conversation. But you get pushed back, no matter what your class is, as some kind of deplorable, a fascist or racist, any Islamophobia you can get your mitts on. You've probably been called it. But friends, in our age, there seems to be a divide between a small c Conservative electorate and the metropolitan elite who control the major political parties. I think the reason that Boris and Brexit brought the red wall, brought my family and the party, frankly, back to life, is that they broke with the Cameroon or Blairite consensus. For a generation, you'd be offered a choice between two forms of new ultraliberalism at the ballot box. Two cheeks of the same behind, if I might put it so bluntly. Only one cheek is a little bit more at ease with market liberalisation than the other one. Low turnout in the recent local elections was, in my view, down to disappointed voters only having two options. You either vote for Reform UK, formerly Nigel Farage's Brexit party, or you just don't vote at all. Many chose the latter, opting not to fulfil their civic duty. And you know, again, it reminds me of my grandfather. He fought in the Korean War in the 1950s to fight for the freedom and democracy that we take for granted in this country. And he was so proud for his entire life of doing that. And that was in his national service. You know, you might consider that somewhat unlucky, but he certainly didn't. It was the only time he ever went abroad. And he was absolutely delighted to have done so, to fight for those values that the Union Jack represent to him. Goes back to what Yoram said at the very start of this conference, actually, that the British inheritance is one incredibly beautiful thing that we mustn't ever forget. Now, some seem to suggest that the Boris Johnson era was a fluke now. They look at the local elections and think, oh dear, we best revert to type. They dismiss Boris Johnson as some kind of populist blonde charmer that managed to tap into a nation that was sick of the Brexit divide and just wanted it all to be over with. But that's to ignore what happened in EU election after EU election. UKIP managed to tap into those same voters with a message that was unapologetic about its support for democracy at the national level. For a rejection of a laser-like focus on global finance and international quangos with an acronym that would seem absolutely powerless to oppose. Voters in these elections were given agency at the ballot box for the first time in my lifetime. And if there's one message that I hear more than any other from people, it's one of fairness. Fairness to receive decent public services for taxpayers that are being squeezed until the pips squeak. Fairness for business to be able to compete in Britain and around the world. Fairness for the domestic population to be treated just as well as illegal entrants coming here via a dinghy. And fairness from the new extreme liberal creed of identity politics that speak of whiteness like it's some form of disease. And fairness that tackles issues like deprivation, like alcoholism, like divorce, like depression, and addiction to illegal and prescription drugs. People just want to be heard. We're a country with 5 million people that are out of work. Now, of course, a portion of that number are simply unable to do so. But there's a large number of this cohort that are just ignored as we fling open our borders to simply employ people from elsewhere. It's too difficult to deal with the British people. You see, voters haven't left the Tories. I actually fear that it's the Tories that have left them. They're seeking, I think, to return to that Cameron conservatism that I mentioned. And the key themes of this conference have been around, not about a rejection of the fundamentals of liberalism that many speakers perhaps take exception to, but this extreme and ideological form that surrounds us today. Conservatives ought to reject it and instead offer answers to the problems that impact us all. There's still a South and North divide, there's still a knife crime problem, there's still a drugs problem in Britain. Instead of seeking to champion victim narratives that serve absolutely nobody, let's hear more about community, belonging, group identity, and the nation-state over an obsession with having a seat at a table. How many times have you heard that? Oh, we can't do Brexit. We need to have a seat at the table. I'm sick of the sodding table, to be frank. As if we need some jumped-up global quango telling us how to do human rights in Britain, the bedrock of those rights. I think the European Court is an absurdity, and Rishi Sunak should have popped along there yesterday and told them we were withdrawn. National conservatism rejects the extreme liberalism that runs rampant through our institutions and culture today. Now, I'm not proposing for a second that we go back to the kind of social conservatism of a Mary Whitehouse era, but we ought to protect the key tenets of classical liberalism, perhaps, that are responsible for the rights that I've just mentioned, arguably. But we must reject this extreme liberalism that seeks to divide, denigrate, and destroy as robustly as Suella Braverman did on this very stage. You see, the Red Wall admire the straightforward frankness and honesty that you'd hear at your local pub. Why are we obsessed with mass migration, predicted to stand at 1 million this year, when a quarter of Hartlepool and half of those in central Blackpool are on out-of-work benefits? We've got one political party that doesn't want to highlight its own neglect in this area, and we've got the other one that actually can't reconcile itself with the idea that actually perhaps being stuck on a life of benefits is perhaps a bad thing. We've heard during this conference that the housing crisis is directly impacting our ability to raise a family. Might I gently suggest that maybe allowing 1 million new entrants into the country is going to be a slight problem if your target is 300,000 homes a year? We all had faith in Brexit. Brexit was going to be the turning point that the political class would wake up and smell the coffee. Hallelujah! It hasn't happened. Issues around wages, welfare, economic reform. Brexit wasn't about a particular model. It was about ensuring our parliamentarians couldn't turn around a bit like Shaggy in the early noughties and say, "Wasn't me." Now it is down to them. It is down to them with the gift of parliamentary sovereignty to enact our wishes, to control our own borders, to assist Darlington over Davos, and to adopt an unapologetically pro-nation stance as our creed. Because, my friends, this is how you maintain some of the most patriotic, decent, and maligned voters in our country. The Conservative Party, in my view, is at a crossroads. And I say it's got to be a bit more brave like Braverman and not clamouring for Cameron. Thank you.